The coalition emergency sessions were held in a mid-level conference room on the station's administrative wing, not in the main chamber. The main chamber was for formal proceedings, the kind with official records and broadcast feeds and the careful diplomatic performance that happened when species needed to be seen taking things seriously. The mid-level conference room was for the other kind of meeting. The kind where people said what they actually thought instead of what they had decided to say. The kind where the agenda was honest about what was on the table. Coordinator Ellen Park had been running these sessions for 8 months, since the point when it became clear that the Horde situation was not going to resolve itself through the standard coalition response toolkit and someone needed to sit in a room with the relevant people every week and work through the problem from scratch. She had been good at her job before this assignment. She was still good at her job. But 8 months of weekly sessions in which every option produced a variation of the same outcome had given her a particular kind of tiredness, not physical, not even emotional exactly, more like the tiredness of a person who has been applying effort and competence and genuine care to a situation and watching none of it move the needle in any significant direction. The Horde had started as a regional problem. That was how the initial briefings had categorized it. A localized aggressive expansion by a mid-tier military power that the coalition's standard peacekeeping framework should have been able to contain. The framework had not contained it. 3 years later, the Horde had expanded its territory by a factor that the early analysts would not have projected as possible, and the coalition's response capacity in the outer reach had been reduced rather than increased, because 2 member species had made the quiet and entirely understandable calculation that their peacekeeping contributions were costing them more than they could sustain. Ellen had not blamed either of them when they withdrew. She understood the math. She just had to figure out what came next with less than she had started with. The session that morning had 8 people in it. Senior representatives from the 5 coalition species still actively contributing to the outer reach effort, plus 2 senior analysts whose job was to translate the raw situation data into language that decision-makers could work with, plus Ambassador Roy Chase, who attended these sessions as an observer and occasionally said things that cut through the accumulated careful language of the room and landed with the blunt clarity of someone who had been in enough rooms like this to have stopped bothering with unnecessary packaging. Roy was 71 years old and had spent 40 of those years in galactic diplomacy. He had been involved in conflict resolution efforts on 3 continents of his home world before he ever left it, and then he had spent the subsequent decades doing the same work at a larger scale. He had the specific quality of the genuinely experienced. Not impressive in the way that people who wanted to seem experienced were impressive, but quietly authoritative in a way that came from having been right about things and wrong about things and having learned accurately from both. He had been largely quiet through the first part of the session, which covered the current operational status in the outer reach and contained nothing Ellen had not already known going in. The Horde's advanced fleet was positioned 2 systems away from Leth space. The Coalition's remaining peacekeeping assets in the region could not effectively engage that advanced fleet without taking losses that the contributing species had already indicated they could not absorb. Diplomatic channels had produced no meaningful response from Horde leadership in 14 months of attempts. The Leth were the part that made the briefing hard to sit through. They were a quiet species. 4 billion people spread across a single home world and 3 small colony stations, none of which had any military capacity to speak of. They had developed through several thousand years of recorded history without a single interspecies war, which in galactic terms was unusual enough to be remarkable, and which had produced a civilization that was genuinely peaceful in a structural sense rather than just an aspirational one. They had no defense fleet because the concept had never generated enough urgency in their political system to produce one. They had no treaty relationships with military powers because they had never needed one. They had, in the Coalition's assessment, approximately 6 weeks before the Horde reached their outer stations. Ellen had been looking at the options list for the last 20 minutes of the session. She had a habit of doing this, going through what was available methodically, column by column, eliminating the things that had already been tried and failed, the things that required resources the Coalition no longer had, the things that the timeline made impossible. The list was getting very short. There was one item at the bottom that had not been formally proposed in any of the 8 months of sessions. It was there in the background documentation. A contingency category, labeled in the dry language of policy frameworks as external rapid response engagement. Everyone in the room knew what it meant. Nobody had brought it up directly because bringing it up directly meant making a decision that felt large in a way that was difficult to fully articulate. Ellen looked at it. She thought about 6 weeks. She thought about 4 billion people on a world that had never built a weapon pointed outward. She thought about 8 months of careful, competent, genuinely well-intentioned work that had produced a situation that was worse than when she started. She put down her pen. "We contact Earth," she said. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when someone says the thing that everyone has been aware of and nobody has been saying. Not shocked quiet, more like the quiet of a held breath. The thing was out now and the room was adjusting to it being out. One of the analysts looked at his notes. One of the species representatives exchanged a glance with the delegate beside her. The two people who had been mid-conversation when Ellen spoke simply stopped talking. Roy Chase, who had been sitting with his arms folded and his eyes on the briefing materials in front of him, leaned back slowly in his chair. He looked at Ellen for a moment with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this sentence to arrive and had not been sure when it would get there. Then he looked at the ceiling briefly. "God help us all," he said. His voice was dry and unhurried and carried the specific tone of something that was not a protest and not a joke and was not exactly resignation either. It was closer to the tone of a person who had been watching a situation build toward an inevitable point and was now simply acknowledging out loud that the point had been reached. Ellen looked at him. "Is that a yes?" Roy looked back at her. "It's an observation," he said. "My vote is yes. Unambiguously yes. We should have had this conversation 4 months ago." He paused. "The observation is separate from the vote." Ellen looked around the rest of the room. The votes came in one by one, some with commentary and some without, all of them arriving at the same place. She opened the communication terminal and began drafting the message to Earth. She wrote it carefully. The situation. The timeline. What had been tried. What remained. What was needed. She read it back once. Then she sent it. Then she sat back and looked at the room and thought about Roy's words, and about what she knew of humanity, and about the specific quality of the door she had just opened and what it meant that it did not have a handle on the inside. The room stayed quiet. Nobody felt like talking very much. Ellen had expected to wait. That was her honest expectation when she sent the message, that there would be a delay of some kind before anything came back. Not because Earth was slow or disorganized but because the message she had sent was substantive and detailed and the kind of communication that required people to read it properly, convene the relevant decision makers, and work through a response that matched the weight of what was being asked. That kind of process took time. A day minimum. Possibly 2 or 3 depending on how the internal discussions went. She had mentally prepared for a day. She had told herself that a day was a reasonable and even positive outcome and that she should not interpret it as insufficient urgency on Earth's part. The response arrived 40 minutes after she sent the message. She was still in the conference room when it came through. The session had not formally ended. People were still present, conversations were still happening in the quiet, processing way of a room that had just made a significant decision and had not fully absorbed it yet. Ellen was at the end of the table reviewing her own notes and thinking about what the next steps looked like when her communication terminal flagged the incoming message with the soft pulse that meant a direct response to a sent communication. She looked at the timestamp. 40 minutes. She looked at it again to make sure she was reading it correctly. 40 minutes from transmission to response, accounting for the signal travel time between the station and Earth's nearest relay point, meant that the actual human response time, from receiving the message to composing and sending a reply, was considerably less than 40 minutes. Someone had read her carefully written briefing, understood it, made decisions about it, and sent back a formal response in a window that most organizations use to decide where to have lunch. Ellen opened the message. It was 3 paragraphs. Clean, plain language, no diplomatic ornamentation. The kind of writing that came from people who had decided what they wanted to say and saw no reason to put extra words around it. The first paragraph was short. It confirmed that Earth's monitoring division had been tracking the Horde expansion for 14 months and had an independent operational picture that was, in several respects, more detailed than the Coalition's own assessment. It named specific systems. It referenced fleet movements that Ellen recognized from her briefings and a few that she did not, which meant Earth's information was coming from sources the Coalition did not have access to. It stated this without commentary, just information placed on the table for context. Ellen sat with that paragraph for a moment. 14 months. The Coalition had been managing this crisis for 3 years and had spent the last 14 months in progressive deterioration, and Earth had been quietly building an independent operational picture of the same situation for that entire period without saying anything to anyone. Not because they were withholding. Because nobody had asked. Because the unwritten rule about not contacting Earth unless absolutely necessary meant that the conversation had not happened, and so Earth had simply watched and documented and waited. She moved to the second paragraph. It outlined what humanity was prepared to commit to the operation. Forces, assets, timeline, deployment structure. Ellen read through it at normal speed and then stopped about halfway through and went back to the beginning and read it again more slowly. The number was not what she had expected. She had been prepared for a significant commitment. She knew enough about human military capability to know that significant was the floor rather than the ceiling, but the specific figure in the second paragraph was larger and more varied than her mental model had prepared her for. It was not just warships. It was a layered structure of different assets performing different functions, some military and some not, described in enough operational detail that it was clear this was not a number someone had generated in 40 minutes. This had been prepared. The outline existed before her message arrived. Someone at Earth had looked at the Horde situation 14 months ago and started building a response framework that was sitting on a shelf waiting for the Coalition to make the call. She set the terminal down for a moment and looked at the middle distance. Roy Chase, sitting 3 chairs away, watched her do this and did not say anything. Ellen picked the terminal back up and read the third paragraph. It was shorter than the first 2. 4 sentences. The first acknowledged the Coalition's existing presence in the outer reach and expressed genuine appreciation for what the member species had committed over 3 years. The second asked that Coalition forces maintain a safe observation distance during the active phase of the operation. The third asked that no Coalition military assets engage independently during that window. The fourth sentence was the one Ellen read 3 times. We find that operations of this nature work best when there is a single decision-making structure during the critical window. We will keep you fully and transparently informed throughout. We ask only that you trust the process. She put the terminal flat on the table and looked at it. Trust the process. From an organization that had responded to a detailed emergency briefing in 40 minutes. From a species that had been quietly building an operational picture of this situation for 14 months without being asked. From people who had a response framework already prepared and sitting on a shelf. She was not sure if trust the process was reassuring or the most quietly confident thing she had ever read in a formal communication. Possibly both. She called the vote. The discussion before the vote was shorter than she expected. Most of the delegates had read the message by the time she called the room to order, and the conversation had the quality of people who were processing something rather than debating it. A few questions were raised, mostly about the observation distance specification and what transparency during the operation would look like in practice. The questions were reasonable and the answers, pulled from the message itself, were adequate. Nobody argued against accepting. The vote was unanimous. Ellen noted this in the session record with the specific observation that a unanimous vote in a Coalition emergency session was not a common outcome and that it said something about the room's read of the situation that it had happened here. Roy Chase voted yes before she had finished calling the roll. Not impatiently, just immediately, with the decisive quality of someone who had made up his mind before the question was formally asked and saw no reason to perform deliberation he had already completed. After the vote, he did not join the small conversations that broke out around the table in the way conversations broke out after significant decisions. He stayed in his chair. He had turned slightly away from the table, not dramatically, just the small repositioning of someone who wanted to think rather than talk. He was looking at the wall to his left, not at anything on it, just at the general direction of it, with an expression that Ellen, watching him from the front of the room, could not fully decode. It was not worry. Roy Chase had the particular quality of someone who had processed most of his worry about things before the relevant meetings and arrived at decisions already settled. It was not satisfaction either, not the look of someone who felt that calling Earth was a victory of any kind. It was closer to the expression of someone watching a door open that they had been standing near for a long time, and feeling, now that it was open, the full specific weight of what was on the other side. Ellen looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at her terminal and began drafting the acceptance message to Earth. She wrote it carefully and plainly, the way the human message had been written, and when she finished she read it back once and found it honest and sent it without changing anything. Outside the conference room window, somewhere in the direction of the outer reach, 6 weeks were counting down in the direction of 4 billion people who had never built a weapon pointed outward and who did not yet know that a conversation had just happened that was going to determine what the next chapter of their history looked like. Ellen closed her terminal. She hoped they had made the right call. She was fairly sure they had. She was also fairly sure that the shape of right, in this particular situation, was going to look different from anything she had planned for. Ellen had been given observer coordinates 3 days before the operation began. The message that contained them was brief and practical: a set of positional data, a recommended minimum distance, and a note explaining that the observation point had been selected to provide clear sensor coverage of the primary engagement zone while keeping Coalition assets outside the operational footprint. It also contained a communication frequency and a contact name, a human liaison officer named Captain Greg Wells, who would be available to answer questions and provide real-time context during the operation. Ellen had appreciated the thoroughness of this. It was the kind of practical consideration that got overlooked in large operations when the people running them were focused on the main event and did not have bandwidth left over for the comfort and situational awareness of observers. The fact that someone had thought to include it said something about how the human planning team approached their work. She moved her observation vessel to the assigned coordinates 2 days before the operation window and spent those 2 days doing what she always did when she was waiting for something significant: reviewing her briefing materials, keeping her log current, and managing the low-level background tension that came with knowing something large was coming without knowing exactly what it was going to look like. Her analyst, a careful and attentive young man named Paul Webb who had been with her team for 8 months and had developed a sharp instinct for what information was worth noting, spent those 2 days running sensor checks and preparing documentation templates. He was thorough and quiet and good at his job, and he had the quality that Ellen valued most in people who worked closely with her. He asked questions when he had them and did not ask them when he did not. On the morning of the operation window, Paul ran a standard sensor sweep of the surrounding space and reported nothing unusual. Clean readings in every direction. The Horde Advance fleet was visible on long-range sensors, moving on its established heading toward Leth space at the same steady pace it had maintained for weeks. The Leth home system was ahead of it, quiet and unaware. Ellen sat at her station and watched the long-range feed and thought about the third paragraph of the human response message and what trust the process actually meant when the process was about to begin. At 0700 station time, Paul said, "The Horde fleet is continuing on schedule. No change in heading or speed. No anomalies on any frequency." Ellen nodded. At 0701 Paul stopped talking. Ellen looked at him. He was looking at his sensor display with the very still expression he used when something was requiring him to check his own readings before he said anything about them. "Paul," she said. "One moment," he said quietly. He ran the sweep again. Then again. Then he turned to her with an expression that was not alarmed. Paul was not easily alarmed, but that had the quality of someone who had encountered data that did not have a slot in their existing framework. "The human ships are present," he said. Ellen looked at the display. She looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. Not arriving. That was the first thing her brain registered and could not immediately move past. In 30 years of watching military operations and fleet movements and every variety of spacecraft doing every variety of thing, Ellen had seen ships arrive. She had seen fast arrivals and slow arrivals and arrivals that produced significant sensor signatures and arrivals that were designed to be as quiet as possible. She had a complete mental library of what it looked like when ships came from somewhere else and got to somewhere new. The human ships had not arrived. They were simply present in a way that the sensor record could not explain. One sweep showing empty space, the next sweep showing vessels already in position, already oriented, already doing whatever they had come to do. The gap between the two sweeps was 11 seconds. In 11 seconds the engagement zone had gone from empty to occupied with no transition data between the two states. She counted the vessels on the display. Then she looked at the positioning. They were not in a formation she recognized. Not the standard engagement formations used by coalition peacekeeping fleets or the aggressive wedge structures favored by the Horde. The human ships were distributed across the engagement zone in a pattern that looked, to her eye, less like a military formation and more like the efficient arrangement of a work crew, each vessel positioned to cover a specific area, with clear sight lines and movement corridors between them, the whole thing organized around function rather than appearance. Captain Greg Wells opened the communication channel at 0702, 1 minute after the ships appeared, with the relaxed professional tone of someone checking in rather than reporting a dramatic development. "Good morning, Coordinator Park. You should be seeing us on your sensors now. We're beginning the initial phase. Nothing you need to do, just wanted to let you know we're underway." Ellen found her voice. "Captain Wells. Your ships, our sensors show no approach data." "That's correct," Greg said pleasantly. "Standard insertion protocol. I know it looks strange the first time. You'll get used to it." A brief pause. "Probably." Ellen looked at Paul. Paul looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. On the sensor display the Horde Advance fleet had clearly detected the human presence. The formation was shifting, not panicking because the Horde was an experienced military force that did not panic, but adjusting with the rapid, practiced response of an organization that had responded to unexpected contacts before and had procedures for it. Those procedures, Ellen would observe over the next 4 hours, were not adequate for this particular contact. The engagement that followed was not what she expected an engagement to look like. She had seen coalition peacekeeping operations. She had reviewed historical records of significant interspecies conflicts. She had a developed understanding of how military confrontations between comparable forces tended to unfold. The initial positioning, the long-range exchanges, the gradual attrition, the point at which one side's losses became unsustainable and the engagement resolved. This did not look like that. It was faster and more deliberate and less chaotic than anything she had a reference for. The human ships moved through the engagement zone with the focused purpose of people executing a plan rather than responding to an evolving situation, as if the evolving situation had been anticipated so thoroughly in the planning phase that responding to it in real time was simply a matter of carrying out what had already been decided. The Horde outnumbered the human force. This was clear from the sensor data and remained clear throughout. But the Horde's numbers were producing diminishing returns in a way that Ellen struggled to explain to herself as she watched, as if the human operational structure was specifically designed to ensure that the size of the force opposing it was not the relevant variable. Greg Wells called in updates every 20 minutes, calm and informative, the voice of someone narrating a process they were entirely comfortable with. 4 hours after the human ships appeared on Ellen's sensors, the Horde Advance Fleet ceased to exist as a functioning military unit. Not destroyed in the catastrophic sense. The sensor data showed that most Horde vessels were still physically present, just no longer operational, no longer coordinated, no longer moving toward anything. The advance that had been progressing for 14 months had simply stopped. The Leth home system was ahead of them on the sensor map, exactly where it had been, untouched. The human ships were already moving. Not standing down, not taking up a holding position. Moving, purposefully, in a direction that her navigation display indicated was toward the next set of coordinates on what was apparently a longer list than Ellen had understood going in. Greg Wells called in one final update in the same calm tone he had used all morning. Initial phase complete. Moving to the next objective. Everything on your end look okay? Ellen sat at her station and looked at the sensor display for a long time. Paul was quiet beside her. He had been keeping his log running throughout, documenting everything with the careful professionalism she had come to rely on, and she could hear the quiet keystrokes of him continuing to write. At some point he had stopped trying to categorize individual observations and started simply recording events in sequence, which was probably the honest response to a situation that was generating data faster than frameworks could be built around it. After a while he stopped typing. "Coordinator," he said quietly. "What are you thinking?" Ellen looked at the space where the Horde Advance Fleet had been 4 hours ago. At the clean, quiet sensor readings where 14 months of momentum had just ended. At the human ships already moving toward the next thing on their list with the unhurried efficiency of people who had more work to do and were going to do it properly. She thought about Roy Chase leaning back in his chair in the conference room. About the specific tone of those 4 words and what she had not fully understood about them when he said them. She understood now. "I understand now," she said quietly, why Roy said what he said. Paul looked at the display. Then back at his log. He did not ask her to explain. He just started typing again. By the end of the first day Ellen had 12 pages of notes. She had not set out to keep a detailed log of the operation beyond the standard documentation her role required. But somewhere in the first few hours of watching the human operation unfold she had started writing things down in the margins of her official forms, and then the margins had run out and she had opened a separate document, and by the time she went to sleep on the first night that document was 12 pages long and she had the specific feeling of someone who has started pulling a thread and discovered it was connected to more than they expected. The military operation was proceeding in the background of everything else, systematic and thorough, and Captain Greg Wells was providing his regular updates in the same calm and informative tone he had used since day one. Each update described another Horde position that had been neutralized, another supply route that had been cut, another staging base that had been removed from the operational picture. The updates had a rhythm to them, regular, steady, the cadence of a process moving forward on schedule because it had been planned to move forward on schedule and the planning had been thorough enough that reality was cooperating. But Ellen found herself spending less and less of her attention on the military updates and more of it on the other thing. The other thing had started on the afternoon of the first day, when her sensors picked up a cluster of vessels that were not warships moving into a system that the human military had secured that morning. She had flagged it in her log and asked Greg Wells about it during his next update. "Medical and engineering deployment," Greg said, in the tone of someone describing something entirely expected. "Standard procedure once a system is secured. We have teams ready to go in as soon as the operational window opens." Ellen had noted this and moved on. Standard procedure, Greg had said. She had taken that at face value. By day 3 she understood that standard procedure, in human operational terms, meant something considerably more substantial than the phrase suggested. The medical teams that had moved into the first secured system were not small units doing triage and basic assessment. They were comprehensive deployments, doctors, specialists, equipment, supply chains, arriving with the organized scale of people who had looked at the damage profile of a system that had been under Horde control and built a response that matched the actual scope of what needed doing rather than a minimum viable version of it. They were on the ground within 48 hours of the system being secured, which meant they had been in transit before the security assessment was complete, which meant someone had looked at the expected timeline and decided to start the medical deployment moving before it was technically confirmed that the destination was ready. The engineering teams were doing the same thing in parallel. Infrastructure that the Horde had damaged or disrupted in its 14 months of expansion. Power systems, communication networks, the basic operational framework that civilizations needed to function, was being assessed and repaired with the same methodical completeness that the military operation was applying to Horde assets. Ellen watched the progress reports coming in from 3 systems simultaneously and kept adding to her log because the scale of what was being coordinated across all of those fronts at the same time was not something she could process without writing it down. On day 3 the Leth situation developed. The Leth had not been hit. Their system was intact, their population unharmed, their civilization proceeding with the ordinary daily life of a species that did not yet fully understand how close the last 6 weeks had been. Ellen had been monitoring their communications channels as part of her observer responsibilities, and the Leth broadcasts were genuinely ordinary: news, cultural programming, the unremarkable texture of a society going about its business. On day 3 a small human vessel arrived at the edge of Leth space and requested a communication channel. Ellen pulled the feed. The vessel was not military. It was a civilian ship with a cultural exchange designation, crewed by what appeared to be academics and linguists and people whose professional description fell somewhere in the general category of people who were interested in other civilizations and wanted to talk to them. They had sent their request in 17 languages, one of which was close enough to the Leth primary language that the Leth communications officer who received it was able to understand the general meaning within a few minutes of first contact. The request was simple. They had been hoping for the opportunity to introduce themselves. They had brought materials, historical, cultural, scientific, that they thought the Leth might find interesting. They had also, the message noted with the kind of specific detail that Ellen found oddly charming, brought food, because in their experience food was one of the more reliable foundations for a first conversation, and they had tried to bring a reasonably varied selection. The Leth said yes before the human vessel had finished transmitting. Ellen wrote 4 pages about this in her log and then sat back and looked at what she had written and thought about what it meant that a cultural exchange team had been dispatched to a species the Horde had been about to destroy, arriving on day 3 of an 11-day military operation, with 17 languages and a varied food selection, as a planned component of an operation that had been framed as an emergency military response. She kept writing. By day 7 the log was 40 pages and she had stopped trying to document individual events because there were too many of them arriving too quickly and the individual events were not the point anyway. She had shifted to trying to find the pattern underneath them, the organizing principle that explained why an operation launched in response to a military emergency was simultaneously running medical deployments, infrastructure repair, cultural exchange, supply distribution, and a dozen other activities that had nothing to do with the Horde and everything to do with the state of the region the Horde had been moving through. She found the pattern on day 7 in the late evening, sitting with her log open and a cold coffee she had forgotten to drink. Humanity had not separated the problems. That was it. That was the whole pattern stated simply. The military problem, stop the Horde, and the humanitarian problem, repair the damage, protect the Leth, address the needs of the civilizations that had been in the Horde's path, were not 2 problems in the human operational framework. They were 1 problem. The operation had been designed to address all of it together from the beginning, which was why the medical teams were already in transit before systems were fully secured, why the cultural exchange team had been ready to deploy to the Leth on day 3, why the engineering platforms were repairing infrastructure and systems where the military was still clearing the adjacent sector. It was not that the humans were doing 2 things at once. It was that they had looked at the situation and identified one thing, a region in crisis that needed to be made whole, and had built a response that addressed the whole thing rather than the most urgent piece of it. Ellen sat with this for a while. She thought about 3 years of coalition emergency sessions. About the careful, competent, genuinely well-intentioned work that she and her team and the member species representatives had been doing in that mid-level conference room. About the options lists and the resource calculations and the weekly assessments of a situation that kept getting worse despite everything being done correctly within the framework that everyone was working inside. The framework, she understood now, had been the problem. The coalition had been treating the military situation and the humanitarian situation as separate tracks requiring separate responses, which was the standard approach and had been the standard approach for as long as she had been doing this work, and it had produced results that were adequate in ordinary situations and completely insufficient here. She opened a new page in her log. She wrote one line. "We should have called them 14 months ago." She looked at it for a moment. Then she saved the document, closed her terminal, and went to find something warm to drink because the coffee had been cold for 2 hours and she had a feeling that the next 4 days were going to require her to be paying full attention. The debrief was scheduled for a full day and ran long anyway. That was not unusual for post-operation reviews of this scale. There was always more to cover than the agenda anticipated, always questions that opened into longer discussions than anyone had planned for, always the specific friction of a room full of people who had been through something significant together and were still in the process of understanding what they had been through. Ellen had run enough of these sessions to know that the formal agenda was less a schedule and more a rough shape that the actual conversation filled differently every time. She had spent the 3 weeks between the end of the operation and the debrief writing her report. It was the longest document she had produced in her career, 64 pages not counting the appendices, and it had taken her most of those 3 weeks to get it right. Not because the events were difficult to describe but because describing them accurately required her to be honest about things that were not comfortable to be honest about, and she had made a decision early in the writing process that comfortable was not the standard she was going to hold the report to. The debrief room was the main chamber, not the mid-level conference room where the emergency sessions had been held. Every coalition member species had sent a representative, which meant the room was fuller than the crisis sessions had been, and the energy was different. Less tight, less pressured, with the particular quality of a room that was doing retrospective work rather than active problem-solving. The crisis was over. The outcome was good. The task now was to understand what had happened and what it meant going forward. Ellen presented first. She had organized her report into sections and she worked through them methodically, the way she always worked through things, giving each section the time it required without rushing toward the conclusion. The operational timeline. The human deployment structure. The parallel civilian operations. The outcomes across each system in the outer reach. The current status of the 3 civilizations the Horde had damaged and the reconstruction work still ongoing. The Leth situation, which had developed in the 3 weeks since the operation ended into something that would have required its own dedicated session to cover properly. The questions started during the 3rd section and did not stop. Some of the questions were technical. Delegates trying to understand specific aspects of the human operational structure, the mechanisms of the medical deployments, how the engineering teams had been coordinated across multiple systems simultaneously. Ellen answered these as thoroughly as she could and flagged the cases where her own understanding had limits, which was more often than she would have liked. Some of the questions were less technical and harder to answer. How had the human planning team anticipated the civilian needs of systems they had not yet secured? How had the cultural exchange team been ready to deploy to the Leth within 3 days of an operation that had been requested 40 minutes before it was accepted? How much of this had been prepared in advance of the coalition's call, and what did it mean that the answer to that question was clearly most of it? Ellen answered these questions honestly, which meant acknowledging that she did not have complete visibility into the human planning process and that what she could offer was observation and inference rather than confirmed fact. The observations and inferences were extensive. The confirmed facts were that the response had been prepared, that the preparation had been substantial, and that the 40-minute reply to the coalition's message had not been the beginning of the human engagement with this situation but something closer to the end of a long preparation period. Roy Chase sat near the back of the room through all of this. Ellen could see him from the front, a familiar presence in her peripheral vision, still and attentive, the expression on his face consistent throughout the morning. Not bored. Not disengaged. Just listening with the particular quality of someone who was confirming things rather than learning them. The formal review took until early afternoon. When Ellen finished her presentation and the last round of technical questions had been addressed, there was a brief recess and then the session moved into what the agenda called open discussion, which was the part of the agenda that was always the honest part. The open discussion had been going for about 20 minutes, covering the practical recommendations that the member species wanted to see incorporated into future coalition protocols, when Paul Webb raised his hand. He was sitting in the junior observer section at the side of the room, the section for analysts and support staff who were present to document the session rather than participate in it. Raising your hand from that section was not standard practice and the room noticed it, and Ellen called on him because she had worked with Paul for 8 months and had developed a reliable sense for when he had something worth saying. He stood up. He looked slightly self-conscious about standing, which was understandable given where he was sitting, but he held his posture and spoke clearly. "I've been in this work for less than a year," he said. "So I might be missing context that changes this question. But I've been sitting here all morning listening to the outcomes and I keep coming back to the same thing." He paused for just a second. "Why did we wait 3 years?" The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of a room waiting for a speaker to finish. The specific quiet of a room that has just heard a question that everybody had been carrying and nobody had said out loud, and is now adjusting to the fact that it has been said. Ellen set down her notes. She had thought about this question many times in the 3 weeks since the operation ended. She had written around it in her report without quite writing it directly, which she recognized now as the same instinct that had kept the question out of the emergency sessions for 3 years. The instinct to frame things carefully rather than plainly, to address the shape of the problem without naming the problem itself. She was done with that instinct. "Because we were afraid of what it would look like," she said. "Asking for human help felt like an admission that we couldn't handle our own region. That the coalition's framework wasn't sufficient. That we needed someone else to come in and do what we couldn't do ourselves." She kept her voice even and unhurried. "And beyond the pride element, honestly, we were uncomfortable with how completely humans engage with things. When they commit to something, they commit to all of it. That level of focus is unsettling when you're not used to being around it. It feels like it takes up a lot of space." She paused. "Both of those things kept us from making a call that we should have made a long time ago." The room was still quiet. Roy spoke from the back without standing up. His voice carried easily, dry and unhurried, the voice of a man who had decided what he was going to say and was saying it. "We watched smaller civilizations get destroyed for 3 years," he said. "Species that are not here in this room today because they were in the Horde's path and we were in emergency sessions discussing our options." He let that sit for a moment. "That is what should go in the summary document. Not the operational outcomes or the protocol recommendations. The fact that we had an option we did not use for 3 years because we were too proud to pick it up." He paused. "Everything else follows from that. The summary should start there." Nobody argued. Several people wrote things down. The rest of the open discussion was quieter than the morning had been. Not subdued exactly, more focused, as if Roy's words had cleared something out of the room and what remained was more honest than what had been there before. The protocol recommendations were discussed and refined and agreed upon with less friction than Ellen had anticipated. The question of how to formalize the relationship with Earth going forward, not as an emergency measure but as a standing arrangement, was raised and received broad support without the lengthy debate she had expected. The session ended at early evening. Ellen went back to her office and sat at her desk and looked at the summary document open on her terminal. She had drafted most of it during the operation and the weeks after, but the first paragraph had resisted her every time she tried to write it. She had started it 4 times and deleted all 4 attempts because none of them felt like the right beginning. She knew the right beginning now. She wrote Roy's words into the first paragraph, as close to verbatim as she could reconstruct them, because they were honest and accurate and said the thing that needed to be said first before anything else could be placed after it. Then she opened a separate communication and wrote a message to Earth's diplomatic office. A formal thank you. A summary of the debrief outcomes. A question, phrased plainly, about establishing a standing emergency protocol that would remove the 3-year delay from the equation the next time a situation like this developed. She sent it. She looked at the clock. Looked at the terminal. Made herself a coffee and drank half of it. 40 minutes after she sent the message, the response arrived. It was short. It said yes. It outlined a proposed framework for the standing protocol in 3 clear paragraphs that suggested, again, that someone on the other end had been thinking about this question for longer than the last 40 minutes. At the bottom of the message, below the signature, was an attachment. No introduction, no explanation, just a file attached without comment. Ellen opened it. It was a list. 17 entries, each one a location and a brief situation summary. Different regions of the galaxy, different circumstances, different stages of development. Some were early indicators, the kind of readings that looked like background noise until someone with the right framework pointed out the pattern. Some were further along than that. All 17 had one thing in common. They were situations the Coalition did not currently have on its active monitoring list. Ellen read through the list slowly. Twice. She looked at the locations and the situation summaries and the careful, factual language that described each one without dramatizing any of them, and she thought about 14 months of quiet monitoring and a response framework sitting on a shelf and a 40-minute reply to a message that had taken 3 years to send. She set the list down. She picked up her communication terminal and sent a message to the 7 Core Coalition representatives who had been in the debrief that day. Emergency session. Tomorrow morning. Attendance required. Then she attached the list without adding anything to it because the list did not need anything added to it. She closed her terminal and finished her coffee and sat quietly for a moment in her office, thinking about 17 situations in different corners of the galaxy, and about the specific weight of knowing about something early versus finding out about it later, and about what it meant to have on your side a civilization that had apparently been paying attention to all of it for a very long time. She hoped the galaxy was ready to start paying attention too. She suspected, based on the last 3 weeks, that it was going to have to be.